okay. I think Zoom's taking a bit more time than usual. But I'd like to, first of all, welcome our first speaker, Dr. Sol Iglesias, an associate professor of political science at the University of the Philippines. Allow me to read her bio. A scholar of democracy and political violence, she bridges research and activism in Southeast Asia. She was the first Filipino and Asian director of political and economic affairs at the Asia Europe Foundation and a 2023 Mellon Scholars at Risk Fellow. Her upcoming book, How a Weak State Governs, explores how local and national politics fuel violence in the Philippines. We also have another speaker for tonight, Francis Joseph Kiko Aquino D. He's a senior lecturer at UP Diliman's Department of Political Science and co-convener of Tindig Pilipinas, a coalition of pro-democracy, civil society organizations, and political parties. His research explores how citizens mobilize and participate in democratic life. He earned his MSc in political science and political economy from the London School of Economics and helped organize the Trillion Peso March, a landmark anti-corruption movement in the Philippines. So I'd like to welcome our two speakers for tonight. Thank you so much for your contribution and for joining our event. We have a few participants already coming in and hopefully more. And so we're really excited to learn about what's happening in the Philippines. I know there have been protests from September, but there also have been protests in November. So we'd like to perhaps start by knowing the timeline, knowing what's been happening, and at the end, hopefully, we'll know what we can do as Southeast Asians in solidarity with the Philippines. So I'd like to first hand the mic over to Sol. Sol, please feel free to share your slides, and we're now excitedly seated for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Raja, and thank you to New Narrative for the invitation and the opportunity. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So tonight, I'll try to talk about the current anti-corruption crisis in the Philippines in four sort of sections. One, it's going to be really political sciencey. So hold on to your seats. I'm going to be talking about democracy and democratic backsliding, just to give us a sort of frame of analysis, and as well as to look at the broad patterns that we're seeing in the Philippines, which has been experiencing a decline in democratic quality in recent years. Then I will give a bit of a backdrop of how we got to this point since the 2022 elections, presidential, national, and local elections. I will delve a little bit into the anti-corruption crisis, which I believe Kiko will also be discussing. And finally, I'll make some observations about the protests, how protests have been mobilized and demobilized in the course of the last few weeks. Okay, so quick. What is democracy? Just to level the ground a bit. So on one hand, you have authoritarian regimes where there is little or even no freedom in more extreme cases, and very, very little accountability. Where you have more freedom and accountability, of course, it is in a full, consolidated liberal democracy with free and fair elections, respect for human rights, and checks and balances between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And you also have electoral accountability to the people. Some people say that there's also what we can consider sort of diagonal accountability to civil society, to the media. That makes a full democracy. So often these two ideal types don't actually exist. And what we more commonly have now, including in the Philippines, is a hybrid regime where the elections are partially free and partially unfair. Human rights are not systematically respected, for instance. Okay, but then understanding democracy allows us also to understand, therefore, what scholars have been noticing more frequently in the last 20 years, where there's been a global decline in the quality of democracy without necessarily resulting in something like a military coup or a self-coup, like the Philippines experienced under former president and the father and namesake of our current president, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. It was a self-coup or an autogolpe, as the literature for some reason tends to call it in Spanish. I think it's a Latin American thing, and an outright election day vote fraud, right? Outright stealing of the election. So these are situations that are more what we should think about as situations of democratic collapse, like one day to the next, like the declaration of martial law on September 21, 1970, well, actually September 23, 1972, resulted in, overnight the immediate arrest of opposition politicians, journalists, activists, and so on. But what we see more and more these days, though, is something called democratic backsliding. So it's an erosion of democratic quality, serious erosion, right? But without democratic collapse. So here we see something like we call executive aggrandizement, which we see in the Philippines. The president, especially, for instance, under President Duterte, former President Rodrigo Duterte, who amasses a lot of power in his office, and there are very little checks and balances. For example, Congress is very compliant. The Supreme Court may be very compliant, and we saw this since the Duterte presidency, and we still see pretty bad quality of democracy, continued democratic backsliding under the present Marcos Jr. government. I also want to point out that there are a lot of these promissory coups. We know this very well in Southeast Asia, like in Burma, Myanmar, or in Thailand, for example, where the generals say, "Oh, we're doing a coup so that we can restore democracy." Although, as far as I'm concerned, promissory coups to quote unquote defend democracy are still coup d'etats. It's still a form of military and illiberal rule. So what does it look like in the Philippines? I hope you can see the data, the graph, because I can't see it. I can't see the right side on my screen. But you see the big trough there is is democratic collapse after the declaration of martial law in 1972. And the upswing is the restoration of democracy in 1986 through people power. Over 4 days in February 1986, people came into the streets to protest the Marcos dictatorship, which resulted in the fall of Marcos Sr. But then you'll see there just slighter reductions in democratic quality. Well, as you can see, first of all, democratic quality in the Philippines, even at the high point post-EDSA, post-people power in 86, has never really been very high, right? But we still see a dip from 2004 to 2009 under the presidency of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and again from 2016, or actually, I think more precisely, using the formula at the bottom of the slide there, from 2019 to the present, where democracy 10 years ago, each year has been better compared to the present year in question. So, for example, today or in 2024, the score for democracy in 2014 was a lot higher, for instance. So that's where we see how we measure democratic backsliding. And this data is also available for Indonesia, for Malaysia. You just look for the varieties of democracy data set online. Okay. So the current crisis has its roots in the last presidential and national elections, national and local elections. Here, for the uninitiated, you can see on the left, President Marcos Jr. and Vice President Sara Duterte, who is the daughter of former President Rodrigo Duterte. So they ran under a banner of called Uniteam. They ran on a campaign cry for unity, and not much else. Like they wouldn't really attend debates, especially if in unfriendly venues, which means just basically normal media sort of organized debates. And what they did was, because they did not run against each other, right? Because they were not necessarily allies. And in the Philippine system, the president and the vice president, they're not on the same ticket, right? You can elect a vice president, for example, from an opposition party. As the previous vice president, Leni Robredo, who was at the leadership, she was the main contender against Marcos Jr. But by combining their forces, this Marcos Duterte unit team was able to crowd out centrist groups or the Pink or Pink allies, led by former Vice President Leni Robredo. But nonetheless, cracks in the Uniteam cooperation, the Uniteam alliance, began to show quite early on in their term 3 years ago, over 3 years ago now, especially over the security sector. So, for example, Sara Duterte wanted to be named Secretary for Defense, because usually the vice president is given some kind of portfolio, especially if they are allies, like in this case. Instead, she got Secretary of the Education portfolio. So she was Secretary of Education. And then after the first year or so, the gap started to widen. During the second budget hearing of their term, Sara Duterte suddenly started getting questions over what were called confidential funds. These are confidential intelligence funds, which later on became the basis of her impeachment. So Sara Duterte actually was impeached by Congress, as per the Constitution, in February this year. Even if there were impeachment complaints filed with the relevant committee, in Congress, the House didn't act until it had a full majority of representatives who endorsed one impeachment complaint. But why is Sara Duterte not impeached? Well, she didn't. This particular impeachment procedure did not go to trial as it should have, as provided for in the Constitution, and I will come back to that. Late last year as well, there were these Quad-Com or Quad 4 committee hearings in the lower house, and also Blue Ribbon Committee hearings in the Senate, questioning former President Duterte, who actually showed up to these hearings, defending his drug war in terms of the extrajudicial killings or large-scale human rights violations associated with it, as well as illicit financing of it. So there were quite a number of features of the drug war, like, for example, financial incentives for the police to basically kill, as Duterte had said in his speeches, which resulted in about 12 to 30,000. That was the estimate of the International Criminal Court, or ICC, prosecutor, in terms of a credible death toll of former President Duterte's war on drugs. So this Uniteam alliance was clearly on the rocks, and this little marriage of convenience eventually, as we know, has basically ended in divorce. So the very technical political science model or paradigm for explaining the factionalism between the Marcoses and the Dutertes are basically a bit of a joke, but sadly half joke, half true, or maybe 90% true. It's because of a sort of gaffe of one of Sara Duterte's supporters in a viral video. People have been jokingly calling this rift a battle between Team Darkness or Team Kadiliman versus Team Kasamaan, which means evil. So basically, you don't really have any, at least between the two biggest political forces that are in political conflict right now, there are just no good options between the two of them. So what happened over the course of this year is that Mr. Duterte was arrested in March by the ICC. And the significance of this is he was arrested in the Philippines, right? Facilitated by the Philippine government. It was a sort of sting operation by the Interior Ministry and the Justice Ministry, who happened to be headed, those two cabinet secretaries are brothers. And the police basically nabbed Mr. Duterte at the airport, and supposedly in compliance with the Interpol, because the Marcos Jr. government, and he even campaigned on a promise that he would never cooperate with the ICC, because the Philippines left the ICC, no surprise, during Mr. Duterte's presidency, as soon as the ICC prosecutor at the time said that she would be opening an investigation into crimes against humanity, thousands of people killed in the drug war, but also more than 1,400 killed in Davao City, where Duterte was a long time mayor, almost 3 decades he was a mayor. He's actually still mayor today, in an odd feature of the Philippine electoral system. Mr. Duterte still ran for mayor in Davao City, but one of his sons is vice mayor and therefore acting as mayor. But in this photo here, now you see Sara Duterte and Mr. Duterte, her father, at the bottom, with their newest adoptee, or the newest adoptee, seeming adoptee into the Duterte family, Miss Amy Marcos, Senator Amy Marcos, who is actually President Marcos's sister. And basically, long story short, in the May midterm elections, even Marcos Jr.'s own sister, who had always been from the beginning, she took credit along with former President Arroyo for brokering Uniteam and convincing Sara Duterte not to run against Mr. Marcos. But she's, always she's long been sort of a gadfly, criticizing her brother. And by May, weeks before the election, she jumped ship very more clearly out of her brother's sort of the sort of administration allied Alianza slate, and cast her lot with the Dutertes, and she squeezed through and she won a second term as Senate. And the Senate, after the May 2025 elections, so by the way, the elections, first of all, resulted in an almost even split between very clearly pro Duterte senators and somewhat pro administration or pro Marcos senators. Meaning, usually, because what you need to understand about Philippine politics, unlike US politics, for example, midterm elections usually go in favor of the incumbent president. This is the last point in which the Philippine president is able to promise largesse, is able to, sort of offer to candidates, because we have a very weak party system, right? So it's very individual. There's a lot of patronage politics and clientelism. And so the biggest patron at the top, the incumbent president, has a machinery of the incumbent and those kinds of advantages. So usually, there have been rare cases in the past otherwise, including in this year's election. Usually the president's slate wins big. And this time, not so much. And part of this was possibly a sort of, exactly this sort of factionalism between Mr. Marcos and Ms. Duterte, which also galvanized the Duterte base, especially over their anger seeing Mr. Duterte carted off. Poor Mr. Duterte, there he goes, old man, weak, and so on. Not the strong man you can imagine. You could have imagined at the height of the drug war when he was still president. Of course, the ICC arrest for the victims of the Duterte administration or the drug war, the Duterte administration's drug war, and also for human beings everywhere. That's why it's a crime against humanity, right? Mass killing as an affront to universal values such as human dignity and the right not to be arbitrarily killed. But still, Duterte's arrest galvanized his supporters and allowed Ms. Marcos and other Duterte-aligned candidates to have a pretty good showing. And so afterwards, no surprise, the Senate eventually, which has already stalled Sara Duterte's impeachment trial, which, according to the Constitution, should have proceeded forthwith, immediately, agad-agad in Filipino, as soon as she had been impeached by Congress. But the Senate before the election and then after with the new composition after the election and the political wind seeming to change in favor of the Duterte faction, the Senate sat on the impeachment trial, and then later on a Supreme Court ruling that the impeachment complaint had already been infirmed from the beginning has effectively derailed this impeachment. There's still some kind of appeal going on, but the likelihood of Ms. Duterte being impeached in this cycle is very low. There's still the possibility of her being impeached after a year has passed from the first impeachment, so in February, but we'll have to see. Because what we understand now, partly about the democratic nature, or the Philippine Constitution it was a post-dictatorship constitution in 1987, and it is democratic in character and spirit. But, over decades, presidents, except for presidents of the Philippines whose surnames were Aquino, one after another tried to change the constitution, usually so that they could stay in power longer instead of the single 6-year term that they had. But nowadays what we see is you don't even need to change the constitution. You just simply ignore it, right? And then you can get away with anything as long as you have the numbers. And yes, okay. So with regard to this current issue, what we've seen basically is the systematic plunder of public finances. So where this starts, at least this particular arc, so because we've had corruption scandals in the past, almost every president since the dictatorship has had a sort of corruption scandal during their tenure. And President Marcos Jr., in his State of the Nation address last July, made a supposed expose. So he said in Filipino, "Mahiya naman kayo." And it wasn't really clear what he meant at the time, because "mahiya naman kayo" means you should be ashamed of yourselves. And so what unfolded over the following days, he started naming big contractors benefiting from public works projects, but finding out and also asking the public to sort of phone in information. Projects that were ghost projects, meaning the money was supposedly spent, but infrastructure, like particularly for flood control, which is a huge problem in typhoon-ridden Philippines. It rains a bit and the streets, especially in urban areas, get flooded. So these projects were going to these big ticket contractors, private contractors, some of whom later on became exposed as what people refer to now as contractors, because some of them were actually members of the Philippine Congress. And so the Senate Blue Ribbon, which is like a good governance committee, and House hearings, these exposés showed that there is a system for plunder. It's not just one person, it's not just a few people colluding. The entire system is built for collusion so that this sort of large scale corruption, billions of pesos, some estimate 1 trillion pesos, or even more, which is about 17 billion US dollars, right? These involve the Public Works Department, so those who build the infrastructure or contract out the projects to the private sector, congressional representatives, so House representatives, the lower house, senators from the upper house of our parliament or Congress, and the entire budget process. So remember when I was talking about checks and balances, right? Well, checks and balances also try to check against corruption. And so the budget process, which starts from the executive and then goes to the legislature, but basically what these hearings exposed was collusion in inserting billions of pesos in these funds, supposedly for public works, but it turned out that contractors were already a part of the process from the beginning, even before bidding. So at the budgetary part, they already kind of give money to fixers in the system, including engineers from the Public Works Department. And everybody apparently gets a cut. So the department requesting the budget, so Public Works, they get a cut, the engineers get a cut, and it goes all the way up. Undersecretary, the secretary, members of Congress. So, for example, the budget committee chair, former Representative Zaldi Ko, is really in the middle of this, and he has fled the country. But he's one of the fixers, one of the key fixers, apparently, based on some of these testimonies. The private contractors are supposed to sort of give the cash up front in order to secure the bid at the level of budgeting. Not even at the correct part of the process where the projects are bid out and then people are supposed to go through a sort of formal bidding process that tries to get the best possible deal for the government. But no, what they've been getting is the best possible deal for the people who control the levers of the approvals process. And even the audit process, which is supposed to be a check against corrupt implementation, even Commission on Audit officials have been implicated in this system of plunder. And then at the same time, you have netizens exposing Nepo babies. Meaning the children actually of some of these people and their lavish lifestyles. Oops. Okay. So now what we have is a legitimacy crisis. There is an independent commission on infrastructure that was organized under the office of the president, which displaced the probes that were open to the public, live streamed, where people were watching and people were getting angrier and angrier by what had been exposed, right? It also resulted in the Senate president, who had helped derail Sara Duterte's impeachment once he also got implicated. And the new majority in the Senate also includes ex-Kakampings. Three senators from the progressive opposition are part of the new majority. Marcos' cousin and House Speaker, so the leader of the lower house of Congress, Martin Romualdez, was implicated and he was forced to resign. And there were also other resignations from the cabinet budget and the executive secretary. When I mentioned fugitive ex-Congressman Zaldi Ko had accused President Marcos Jr. of also benefiting from this sort of system of payoffs, which implicated the budget secretary and the executive secretary in the office of the president. So as you can see, the noose is closing tighter and tighter, and the president is in the middle of it. Like the implications are drawing closer and closer to home, to an extent that it's becoming really difficult for him to evade responsibility. Like, oh, I don't know what is going on, right? You can't. That's not an excuse. He's the president, and it's his family members that seem to be in on it. Of course, proof still needs to be properly discerned, right? Some of these accusations have been made, but we still need to properly sift through it. But still, what seems to be the case is that it's widening exposure, right? It's not just flood control infrastructure, but it's public infrastructure overall. And cases have been filed with the ombudsman. Arrests have been made, especially projects related to Zaldi Ko, where he's directly implicated. And what is, I think, more credible than sort of political rivals going after each other, trotting out their own witnesses and stuff like that, is the work that is being done by investigative journalists. For example, they found that Sandro Marcos, the president's son, who is now one of the deputy speakers of the House, and former House Speaker Martin Romualdez were beneficiaries of a form of pork called allocatables, maybe, in the budget, but basically discretionary funds. Okay, so finally, I hope in the last, at least if I still have a few minutes left, I'd like to talk about the protests that have occurred, because as I mentioned earlier, in this situation where democracy has been backsliding, the checks and balances are not working, right? Even elections have not been working properly because people don't really have much of a choice when most of the we have an extremely weak party system, and most of the politicians, therefore, that people have to choose from basically come from what we call trapos. They're traditional politicians, members of political dynasties, who have basically been part of this system of plunder as well, right? Benefiting from corruption in many different ways. And so what remains perhaps to us as a democratic check against the executive, against corruption, and against excessive state power is protest, and I would also add the media. But speaking of protests, so what we find in the Philippines is centrists. Centrists include progressive members of the opposition, basically opposition politicians who have been part of traditional political parties, but also may be part of or work with political dynasties and that sort of thing, but certainly have been part of, how should I put it, what some scholars call the traditional opposition, right? But also leftists. So the socialist parties and the communist parties, they have what we call, or we have what is called a party list system, which when it first started was really progressive because it was meant to include seats in Congress for members of marginalized basic sectors like labor and women and the youth and so on. But unfortunately, the party list system has been curtailed. Still, we still see centrist and left-wing parties forming the progressive opposition often in political processes, and especially in terms of civil society groups allied with them, as key to mobilizing protests. And when all of this started, you must remember that we had Nepal and even Indonesia in July of this year, right? this sort of summer of discontent as the backdrop. And looking at Nepal, and before that Bangladesh, and before that Sri Lanka, where actual incumbent governments fell due to Gen Z protests and that sort of thing, or in as an immediate sort of precipitator for the fall of these governments, right? So there seemed to be this air of possibility, including, the sort of motivation, this sort of anger over what we had been seeing. So we saw crowds of tens of thousands of people, two separate venues that kind of coalesce around, well, on the left, the Baha Luneta protests. Oh, I'm sorry. That should be Luneta, not the EDSA People Power Monument. And then the Trillion Peso March in the afternoon of September 21, which is also the anniversary of the declaration, or the sort of the anniversary that is usually celebrated as the declaration of martial law. But then we also see how people's anger can be divided. So, for example, what we saw on September 21 at a smaller scale, but what we've also seen in the past in regime-changing governments in the year 2001, which we call EDSA, where the 86 people power protests, rebellion, and uprisings had occurred. There was an EDSA DOS that had unseated President Joseph Estrada, also due to plunder, impeachment, and then an impeachment derailed, but people came out into the street. But there's also EDSA Tres, which was primarily an urban poor protest in support of the deposed president, or the resigned president. And then what we saw on September 21, where there were some pockets of urban poor protesters using violent means, but also police using violent repression against them, right? And this has also tended to divide the center and the left over how to deal with this issue of violence during protests, because since 86, our protest culture overall, center and left, has generally been quite peaceful. Overall, there are exceptions, but overall. Whereas the rightists tend to rely on command mobilization. For example, huge crowds at an Iglesia Ni Cristo rally, which was also anti-corruption, and not ostensibly pro-Duterte. In fact, they didn't allow some explicitly pro-Duterte groups to join them when at their protest in Luneta. But at the same time, Amy Marcos was one of the speakers, where she made all sorts of damning accusations against her own brother. So, and earlier they also had come out in protest again. In the interpretation of which earlier this year that they had come out in these sort of huge numbers, 600,000, for example, a couple of weeks ago, and also tens of thousands before that, against Sara Duterte's impeachment, although they also called it, protest for unity in the government, something like that. Okay, finally, one thing that is concerning, of course, is therefore the dissipation or the potential dissipation of the people's mobilization. So what we've been seeing is a division between the centrists and the leftists. Just last weekend, protests, the crowds have dwindled. So Baha Luneta, not EDSA People Powers Monument, was the location. Oh, I see. I did it the wrong way around. I'm sorry. It should have been a crowd estimate of around 3,000. Whereas the Trillion Peso March 2.0 at the EDSA People's Powers Monument had, so they had a 6,000 estimate, and then Baha Luneta had about 3,000. So down from tens of thousands, and maybe 100,000 people all over the country on September 21 in total. You had far smaller crowds last weekend. So part of the issue that we can probably discuss in greater detail is competing pathways out of this corruption crisis, reformist versus radical prescriptions, right? And then the backdrop of this is an increased willingness of the state to repress mobilization. So, for example, what you can actually see here on the left with the barricade is that Baha Luneta protesters were not allowed to go near, even anywhere near the Mendiola Bridge, which had been a site of a pitched battle between police and protesters, like a violent pitched battle between police and protesters who were not necessarily part of the organized component of Baha Luneta last September. But now, because of, it was easier for the police to use those pockets of violence to be more repressive over the past weekend, to be more restrictive. And also, this is also part of a broader arc of police repression against students, militarization in school campuses, and that sort of thing. So it needs to be also read in a bigger, broader sort of backdrop of protest. Okay, so I would just like to make a few points in the hopes and aspiration that we can still move forward and still try to find solidarity against corruption, but also against this terrible system that it's not just about corruption, right? It's just undemocratic, right? And it is undemocratic, and it favors the traditional elite, particularly political dynasties. So there, at least I see between. So I'm in this. I'm appealing more to the progressive center left, who that has a demonstrated history of being pro-democracy and is the last sort of democratic check against a continued backsliding towards, sort of slow backsliding towards authoritarian or illiberal rule. So there at least has been a common position against instituting any sort of military junta or allowing for the military to take over. There is, I think, a common ground of a common belief in the democratic spirit of the 1986 Constitution, even if the tactics differ over how best to follow the Constitution. So, for instance, the trillion peso marchers, even if, okay, it's a bit complicated because we tend to talk about it as two groups, but actually there's, within each of these two poles, there's also many more groups with also very different positions from one another. But ultimately, they're coalescing, and so for the trillion peso protesters, for example, they want to stay fully within the Constitution. They're more reformist. They talk about a law finally to outlaw a law against political dynasties, right? Whereas the Baha Luneta marchers, who are more on the left rather than the center, have called for a People's Transitional Council, but in the spirit of the Constitution. So some versions of it have talked about a constitutional commission. But there is some kind of common ground in the pro-democracy nature of their calls, even if the details and the means that they espouse are different. There's a determination to find the truth and end systemic corruption. So I believe that there are some areas for dialogue. What needs to be discussed is the position around sedition and the response to violence, right? We want our protests to be peaceful, but when violence occurs, we want to be on the side of victims of police violence, for example. There needs to be dialogue over the ongoing political analysis, where the still positions differ, but let's continue to have, or it would be good to see continued dialogue. There can be better tactical coordination for protest mobilization, so that that the two groups at least do not cannibalize each other's support. There can be more dialogue over what are the parameters for genuine reform, right? How do we know that if we go down the reform route, then how do we know that it's genuine and not, again, co-opted? On the other hand, there can also be dialogue for, okay, what are the conditions that we see that are so extreme enough that we can agree to start thinking more towards these more radical options for transition. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sol, for your presentation. Very helpful for understanding the well, everything that's happening in the Philippines. And to be honest, Cameron and I were going back and forth like, okay, so this is this, and then this is this. Okay, so we're getting it on who are these people, and then like, okay, and we flip, from Wikipedia pages to other pages. So I think we're finally getting a better grasp on things, and also very interesting to follow up on potential conversations that I think specifically people between the left could have. But before we go into that, I'd like to welcome Kiko to present his slides next. So very excited for this one as well. So I'm handing over the mic to Kiko.
Right. So, good evening to everyone. So, I'm Kiko Akinudi. I'm a co-conven. I am also a member of the UP Department of Political Science part-time, but I'm also a co-convener of Tindig Pilipinas, which is one of the groups associated with the Trillion Peso March. So, I'll be speaking today a bit more from um, from an on the ground perspective, and definitely a much more um what's the proper term? A much more situated position, I think, where I'm at least involved with like one of the groups that are active here. So it's not really an it's while I'm gonna attempt to give an overview, it's not really coming from an overhead position, if to be clear. I'll also just probably mention for transparency that if you'll notice my middle name, I'm also related to the two former Aquino presidents. So I'm the grandson of one and the nephew of the other. So there's also that. Basically take take what I say with a grain of salt, basically. But yeah, I'm just gonna present here a slightly narrower timeline of the development of the anti-corruption issue, and also maybe at the end just think about what are the different paths forward that have emerged basically in the discourse around the corruption issue. And I look forward more to the discussion we'll be having afterwards, since this is really just a timeline of events right now. Okay, so I won't be adding too much to what Sol discussed, but I think one aspect that I think is worth highlighting is that flood control in the sort of political discourse in the Philippines first emerged, I think, actually in the State of the Nation address of President Marcos last year, where he claimed as an achievement the completion of over 5,500 different flood control projects throughout the country. And then days later, Metro Manila and various other parts of the northern and central Philippines experienced pretty massive flooding in the wake of another typhoon being hit. So this was seen as a an almost real time fact check of the State of the Nation address, right? So um, I believe, not that I know firsthand, but I believe that that may have played an element into Marcos making flood control a highlight of his State of the Nation address this year around. So just parking that there. Um, right. Again, Sol discussed the aftermath of the May 2025 election, and again, it was seen as a rebuke of the Marcos administration. Again, largely because the coalition that supported him in 2022 was largely drawn from Duterte supporters. More than half, I imagine, more than like half of his coalition came from that bunch. So the split between Marcos and Duterte has hurt Marcos politically, and also it's also notable that President Marcos experienced record low poll ratings, I think, in March of 2025. This is the first time a president experienced greater dissatisfaction than satisfaction in the Philippines since Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. No? So, and this is on the back again, off the back of the Duterte split, but also in the sort of months prior, in the last 2 or 3 quarters of 2024, um, the Philippines experienced sort of record high self-rated poverty, which is a survey-based poverty metric that is done primarily by the social weather stations here in the Philippines. So we saw there is also a sort of economic aspect, at least, to the dissatisfaction with President Marcos, other than the politics of the split. Um, right. So again, as Saul mentioned, President Marcos highlighted the issue of flood control in this year's State of the Nation address, and it's also, I think, worth noting that this State of the Nation address came off the week immediately prior to the State of the Nation address. Classes were canceled in Metro Manila for a whole week because of typhoon rains and flooding. So flooding became a major was really a major sort of part of it was definitely in people's minds during this time, right? And so he made flood control a central part of his State of the Nation address. A little over a week later, he, as Saul mentioned, launched the Sumbong sa Pangulo, so right, tell to the president website, to receive reports of corruption, and also he named and shamed 15 different contractors that cornered basically 20% of all flood control projects in the country. Right. This was supplemented in August, about a week later, again by Senator Ping Lacson, who is, while viewed as fairly independent, ran under the slate of President Marcos in the midterm election. He delivered an expose in the Senate where basically he alleged that 20 to 25% of the budget for flood control projects basically go straight to the pockets of the individual legislators that endorse these projects, with another 10 to 15% being allocated to other agencies as sort of rent, right? So, or it's corruption, basically. The term standard operating procedure was introduced here to denote that basic the deduction, or the deduction in the budget due to all of these people you need to bribe, for lack of a better term. And then the upshot was combined with around 10% that goes to the allowable profit for the contractor, and another 10-ish% that goes to taxes. Only 40% of the budget of a flood control project will actually go to the construction of the infrastructure, right? So that was the bottom line of his intervention. Around this time, public outrage mounts. So again, I think the two most common targets for outrage at the time were a contractor called Sara Diskaya. She actually gained some notoriety already in the midterm elections because she contested in Pasig City Mayor Vico Soto, who is widely seen as a clean and reformist mayor in Pasig. He also, although he comes from a dynasty himself, he's from the same family as the current Senate president. He was able to displace a longtime dynasty in the city of Pasig, right? And fairly early on in the election cycle, it was noted that the Discayas were pouring in a lot of resources into Pasig. So it became sort of from it being sort of a clear win for Mayor Soto, it became one of these races to watch. Soto eventually did win by a very convincing margin, but part of the campaign that for Sara Diskaya was a profile piece on her, where she sort of displayed again her fairly ostentatious lifestyle, several luxury cars, a large house, and in fact, she mentioned explicitly in that piece that she only started making a lot of money in construction when she started getting contracts from the Department of Public Works and Highways. So this, when the flood control scam sort of emerged, and I think a little bit either before or after President Marcos showed that list of 15 contractors, this video of Sara Diskaya was surfaced and became the butt of a lot of anger. She and her husband would become frequent resource people in the different hearings of in the lower house and in the Senate on corruption. They ended up naming several they ended up naming um several legislators involved in the corruption issue, but also there are accusations that they may be a bit more biased towards those aligned with Duterte, given the that Duterte's allies seem to be pushing very strongly for them to become state witnesses. The other heavy target for public ire was a lifestyle vlogger called Claudine Ko. She is the niece of former House Appropriations Committee Chair Zaldi Ko, who again, as Sol mentioned, is currently out of the country fleeing the cases that are being filed against him. In fact, when the timing of his departure is interesting because when this issue emerged, he was already out of the country for allegedly for health reasons. So there's a bit of a question about like why were these people so prepared, it seems, for the issue to emerge. And again, this is all happening again, as Sol mentioned, against the backdrop of massive protests against corruption in Indonesia and Nepal, right? So, bit more of a timeline. The first person to actually call for a rally, a big rally on September 21 was former Congressman Teddy Casino. He tweeted this out. And he would later be more associated with the Baha Luneta group. Right. So that was on September 1. But resignations start occurring here with the DPWH secretary resigning on this day. Protests start heating up during this time, and maybe one of the more featured smaller scale protests was on December 4, where the gate of St. Gerard construction, which is owned by the Discayas, was defaced by protesters. And sorry, I failed to mention it here, but there was another protest that defaced the signage of the Department of Public Works and Highways. And I believe Manila City Mayor Isko Moreno used this as pretense to have a much more combative sort of stance against the protests that happened in Manila. So we see uh, um, yeah, so that sort of explains a bit, or doesn't explain, definitely explains not the whole thing, but there's that element in terms of the difference in police response. Um, there were also changes in leadership in both the Senate and later on in the House of Representatives, with um, Tito Soto, who is seen as who ran with President Marcos, replaced Chiz Escudero as Senate President. Escudero, while initially viewed as a Marcos ally, ended up favoring Sara Duterte in the impeachment case against her. And the replacement of Escudero happened on the heels of one of his top campaign donors being the owner of one of the top government contractors involved in infrastructure projects. I forget if specifically flood control as well. The development here is that the Commission on Elections, a division of the Commission on Elections, um, recently recommended not to pursue a case against Chis Escudero for violation of campaign financing laws. So that's another sort of developing issue. The Independent Commission on Infrastructure was established on September 11th. So this is a commission that is tasked to investigate corruption. And around this time, or sorry, a little bit after this, both the House of Representatives and the Senate sort of, for different reasons that will be discussed later, ended up wrapping up or pausing their own investigations on the flood control corruption. So a lot of attention was then shifted to the Independent Commission on Infrastructure. But as what would emerge later on is while the commission got a lot of participation from the different sort of resource people involved in the issue, um, issues emerge regarding its powers to hold people in contempt. So the Diskaya couple unilaterally decided after appearing a couple of times with the ICI to halt their participation, and there's nothing the commission can do about it in the absence of the contempt powers that Congress holds. There's also a question of like the resource allocation for the independent commission, where it was mentioned that they a lot of their staff are operating on a volunteer basis, and so on. So the commission was established, and this was something that I think a lot of anti-corruption advocates were calling for in the lead up, but there are a lot of holes in the floor as far as the commission is concerned. Um, right. So on September 10, if I'm not mistaken, 10 or 11. Baha Luneta is announced September 21. This is largely the supporting groups largely came from schools and student groups. And around this time, massive walkouts were staged in different universities. I think in the University of the Philippines, we had one, a very big one in September 12, where something like 5 to 7,000 students sort of engaged in the walkout. So this was going on the student end. And then September 15, in a joint presser with the Bahasa Luneta organizers, the Peso March, which was more led by religious groups, was announced for the same date at the EDSA People Power Monument, September 17. Martin Romualdez, because a lot of the accusations were getting closer to him, steps down as Speaker of the House. Um, I will regarding the counts of the protests, I will say that since I come from the organizers, I do give the organizers reported counts, right? So which tend to very heavily differ from the official counts reported by the police. No? So again, take that with a grain of salt. But that being said, as I understand it, Luneta announced an attendance of like 100,000 people, and EDSA announced an attendance of around 120,000. So, big protests, very significant participation on both ends. As was mentioned by Sol, a smaller group of protesters in Mendiola, which is near, also in Manila, near Luneta, that it's marching distance from Luneta. A smaller group of protesters there ended up being joined by certain unruly elements, and a violent dispersal by the police forces were triggered. There were reports of police brutality and video evidence of that. 216 arrests were made. 89, I think, were based on a report that I was just going over earlier. 89 arrests were minors, and from the testimony of people who were there. No, a lot of the people arrested weren't even necessarily involved in the protests. It's just I think a lot of the people who engaged in some of the more unruly behavior were wearing black shirts, and so I think the police, when they started arresting people, um just took anyone they saw wearing black in the area. And that might be an exaggeration, but I think that's how a lot of people uninvolved in the protests ended up being arrested. Also, in the hours leading up to the 21st and a little bit after, reports of an attempted coup started emerging. This was triggered, not quite triggered, but this entered into the discourse a few days prior when Chavit Singson, who is a politician from Marcos's home province in Ilocos, basically called on, sort of condemned the corruption and called for the creation of a church military junta, which was not received very well by either of the protest groups. But there were discussions in the lead in this vicinity of an attempted coup taking place, and I think not that the armed forces would ever corroborate these claims, but the chief of staff of the ANP, General Bronner, issued a statement saying something to the effect that September 21 was a turning point for the armed forces. So I think that's as close to a confirmation of an attempted coup that one might expect to get. Um, September 24, the House of Representatives concludes their hearings. September 25, in September 25, there's a very lively hearing at the Senate where Senator Rodante Marcoleta, who is aligned with the Dutertes, introduced a surprise witness into the hearings. And the witness, Orly Gutesa, implicated directly Speaker Martin Romualdez in the corruption issue. He claimed that he would deliver monies to Zaldico and Speaker Romualdez. It would emerge that the notarization of his affidavit was falsified. Um, and I think a little bit after this, the Senate would also conclude its hearings because there were questions were um, the Blue Ribbon Committee Chair, Senator Lacson, was questioned because he was starting to implicate a lot of his colleagues in the Senate. Around this time, the ICI experienced its first resignation as well. So the Independent Committee on Infrastructure, Benji Magalong, who is the mayor of Baguio City and a longtime anti-corruption advocate, resigned from the commission because there were questions about the propriety of a sitting elected official being part of the commission. So he resigned rather than allow those questions to continue. Um, a few days later, October 1, the second trillion peso march is announced for November 30. Um, so on October 3, as part of that announcement, White Friday protests were announced. So every Friday, different groups associated with the trillion peso march would organize smaller pockets of protests in different parts of Metro Manila in the Philippines. And also during this time, student protests largely continued, right? So I think one of the big state university systems in the Philippines, the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, staged a system-wide walkout. I believe it was October 10, but I'd have to double check that. So again, pockets of protests continued throughout this period. Again, as mentioned, Senator Lacson resigned as Blue Ribbon Committee chair, following complaints from the senators. October 7, the then Justice Secretary of President Marcos, Crispin Boying Remulla, was appointed as ombudsman. So the ombudsman functions as an independent sort of investigator for corruption that then that has the power to file cases against sitting officials. Previously, the ombudsman was a man called Samuel Martirez, a former Supreme Court justice, was seen as who sort of stonewalled a lot of the anti-corruption efforts done against. He was appointed by President Duterte, but he introduced, for instance, a policy of restricting the release of the statements of assets and liabilities, assets, liabilities, and net worth of politicians. The appointment of Justice Remulla on the positive side was seen as ending that kind of untransparent and very inactive stance of the ombudsman. But on the negative side, was seen as a very political act because Remulla is seen as a longtime ally of President Marcos. There is a long gap between October and November because I took a bit of a vacation from organizing during this time. So my memory is a bit more fuzzy of that time. But the timeline picks up with Lacson returning as Blue Ribbon Committee chair. And then the next major event was on November 14. Zaldico, who again was the former House Committee on Appropriations chair, and is currently outside of the country, releases a video on his personal Facebook page accusing President Marcos of direct involvement in the corruption issue. This is in the lead up to the protests organized by the Iglesia Ni Cristo and a smaller group called the United People's Initiative. No? So the Iglesia Ni Cristo announced a 3-day protest. I forget when they made the announcement, but they announced a 3-day protest in Luneta, spanning from November 16 to 18. Ostensibly, this was just a protest about transparency and accountability. They did not claim to make any calls for resignation or anything beyond that. Although, at least on the end of the groups I represent, the Iglesia Ni Cristo has been seen to be quite supportive of the Duterte camp. It might be worth mentioning that earlier this year in January, they staged a protest in response to the impeachment complaint against Vice President Sara Duterte, which they branded as a rally for peace, but was widely seen as one in opposition to that impeachment. So it was expected that this protest would be again a bit more aligned with the Duterte camp and maybe would call for um something more radical as far as Marcos is concerned. But really, they just kept within the general calls for transparency and accountability. The protests were largely peaceful. I believe the official count for the number of protests who appeared was 650,000 people. The most interesting that happened was, as Sol mentioned, the speech of Senator Amy Marcos, which was very critical of the president, to put it mildly. Um, Interesting also was that, as Saul mentioned, people who were very openly supporting who were openly aligned with Duterte and were calling for the resignation of President Marcos were not allowed to participate in the Iglesia Ni Cristo protests, and so they moved to a nearby area called Liwasang Bonifacio, where they staged their own protest. At the same time, the United People's Initiative, which was associated with a number of personalities aligned with Duterte, was held at the EDSA People Power Monument. Each of these groups, outside of the Iglesia Ni Cristo, drew a few thousand people. I think the UPI protest, which was at People Power Monument, drew around 4,000 people. I didn't get a count for the Liwasang Bonifacio, I'm afraid. On November 17, Ombudsman Remulla announces a deadline of December 15 for the filing of cases against Big Fish, and he, I believe, has named a number of senators, including a number of personalities aligned with Sara Duterte, such as Joel Villanueva, Jingoy Estrada, a few others. Um, the Department of Budget and Management Secretary, Amena Pagdanganan, and Executive Secretary Bersamin, both resigned because they were implicated in the video sort of testimony of Zaldico. Although the president himself stated that he would not dignify the accusation that he himself was implicated. I believe Senator Lacson also gave a speech around this time reconciling that while these certain elements of the cabinet were involved, President Marcos himself was not, which I'm not sure how that was taken as well. Um, and again, the rally in Luneta was the Iglesia Ni Cristo rally was ended early at the end of the remarks of Senator Amy Marcos. I think to this day it's unclear what the public appreciation of the Zaldico testimony is. A number of other videos have emerged since then, videos and posts. Um, I think that there are elements on both the right and left of politics that believe it strongly, but also there are a lot of questions in the I think in the center there are a lot of questions as far as some of the more contradictory elements of Zaldico's testimony. So I think that's something that we're watching very closely if suddenly public opinion turns in one way or another as far as that testimony is concerned. The rally, the rally in People Power Monument, organized by Duterte supporters, was halted from proceeding to their planned third day on November 18, allegedly because seditious statements were made in the previous days. It was never made clear what those seditious statements were. No. What we know is that the rally explicitly called for the resignation of President Marcos. But I think most people's understanding of the Constitution is that such a call is not considered seditious. So it's fairly unclear what actually caused the Quezon City Police to disallow the continuation of the rally. On November 19th, Baha Luneta 2.0 was announced, also for November 30. November 24 saw the arrests of the first few arrests made for against people implicated in the flood control scam. 8 arrests were made and 16 warrants were issued. Of these 16, Zaldico is the only politician who was included in the first batch of warrants. So um the the Trillion Peso March also held its press conference announcing the details for its November 30 rally. And unlike the lead up to September 21, no joint press conference was done between the two groups this time around. On the day itself, we did see smaller crowds gather at both sites. Again, if I'm going to give the official organizers' estimates, I believe Luneta's official estimate was at 20 to 20 to 40,000, I think. And then on our end, I think our own official estimate is 40,000 for People Power Monument, but the official PNP monuments estimates are both below 10,000. So again, believe who you want to believe there. There was some friction in Luneta because police initially disallowed um organizers from Luneta setting up. It's worth noting that on both days, I believe both days, Manila City Mayor Isko Moreno did not or issue a permit for the protest in Luneta, although because Luneta is a freedom park, I believe it's not really necessary to issue a permit, but nonetheless, there was a fairly combative stance between the Manila police and Luneta. Although, as I understand it, although I may be wrong, but there were no violent encounters to the level of September 21 that occurred in Luneta or Mendiola or any of the other protests on that day. We also it's also as Sol may have mentioned, it's also important to note that the friction between the Luneta and EDSA groups have increased in the last few days. This is the discourse right now surrounds the speech that was given by um, Pablo Virgilio Cardinal David, who's a religious leader here in the Philippines. But he made some comments referring to Luneta, which I think at the time when I heard them appreciated as talking about the Iglesia ni Cristo rally, but I think the consensus view now is that it was actually it might have actually been criticizing the Luneta group, and that has caused a lot of sort of back and forth between both sides. I think the worst of it has calmed down, I think, but it is still something we're keeping an eye on. And then just yesterday, another member of the Independent Commission on Infrastructure, Secretary Dave Singson, also announced his resignation. He mentioned both health issues as being one of the primary reasons for his resignation, but also the insufficiency of both the legal mandate and the resources allocated to the ICI. So he's calling for Congress to pass a bill that establishes a stronger commission. But from this point, again, I think the direction that these protests will go is really wide open, right? I think the way that I think what a lot of the more centrist groups, as Saul characterizes them, would want to see is basically the continuation and intensification of investigations on the protests, right? In addition to the passage of a number of reform measures such as the anti-political dynasty law, which suddenly I think has seen. Traditionally, it's not a popular measure, but because of the whole sort of nepo baby aspect of corruption, I think there's been a recognized opening as far as that's concerned. The speaker that replaced Martin Romualdez, Speaker Boji D, has stated his support for such a law. And so reforms alongside continued investigations, I think, are the broad calls of the, or generally is the call of the more centrist groups. Definitely, I think the Duterte aligned groups are calling for the resignation of President Marcos and therefore the elevation of Sara Duterte as president. I think groups who are more on the left are calling for the resignation of both President Marcos and Sara Duterte, who herself has credible cases of corruption against her, which alongside her death threats against the presidential family sort of sparked the corruption cases against her. So there's a call for both to resign. Um, the post resignation scenario, I think, is also needs to be fleshed out a bit because on the one hand, I think what the constitution prescribes is if both the president and the vice president are unable to perform their functions for any reason, the Senate president, who is currently Tito Soto, seen as again somewhat independent but maybe aligned towards President Marcos, Tito Soto would take over. And I think it's not been stated explicitly, but against that backdrop is a lot of contests for the leadership of the Senate, and that's something we can maybe get into if the group is interested in it. But again, the constitutional prescription is that the Senate president will take over as acting president, and he is mandated to pass and Congress rather is mandated to pass a law calling for a special election within I forget if it's 60 or 90 days of the vacancy occurring. So an early election. One scenario is an early election. There are groups on the left that have floated the idea of the transition council, as Saul mentioned. Although I was corrected on this myself, so I should also mention that. Um, Similar to the Trillion Peso March, the official position of Baha Luneta was not really to call for the resignation of Marcos and Duterte or for a transition council. It was similarly also just general intensification of the anti-corruption campaign. Although I think groups associated with the transition council did participate more in Baha Luneta, and the Trillion Peso March side was a bit more restrictive towards those groups. And then again, as Saul mentioned, none of the progressive groups or democratic groups, I don't know how you want to call it, none of them really advocated or supported the idea of a military intervention especially even when it was raised by certain personalities like Chavit Singh Son, or I think it came up again during the time. It may have come up again during the time of the pro Duterte rally in People Power Monument in November. One interesting aspect of the People Power Monument actually is it's right beside Camp Aguinaldo, which is where the sort of command structure, as I understand it, I'm not really a military expert, but as I understand it, the command structure of the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, is housed there. So it is seen as but not just for its historic value, but it's also seen as a strategic site for protest, even by those I think who are more interested in that kind of military adventurism. But again, I think this can go a number of ways. I think I think the immediate feeling after November 30 was that I think it was speaking candidly, it was maybe a good day for President Marcos. Both rallies saw lower participation, which could be spun as okay, people might be more satisfied with the direction that the administration is going. Although now that with the resignation of Babe Singson, again, the questions again emerge, basically asking whether Marcos has his does he really have his hand on the ball as far as the corruption issue is concerned. And if he doesn't, then emerge all of these pre 2028 scenarios, because 2028 is our scheduled next election. So again, a lot of questions, not a lot of answers, but that's what I have to share for you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiko, for your thorough presentation. I think we're getting a much clearer idea on what's been happening so far up until December 3rd. So it's pretty much still ongoing. Today is December 4th.
Right.
So a lot to talk about. So we now head into the Q&A. We do have a few burning questions Cameron and I have been discussing in the background as well. And we've changed a little bit the Q&A list that we had. And I think it's mostly because we had, I think, two burning questions that we'd like to ask, and we have 20 minutes for the Q&A. So until 9:25 PHT, and we're welcoming all of the participants to join in on the Q&A as well. We haven't seen any in the chat box or any in the DMs, so feel free if you have questions. But in the meantime, let's ask some of the questions that Cam and I have written. So let's go to the first one. This is actually a two-parter question, one more toward Sol's presentation and one more toward Kiko's presentation. But I think you'll have to answer the other to get the full image or the full answer. But basically, right, what's going to happen in the coming weeks? I think Kiko has touched on that a little bit, but I think we'd like a sort of personal insight, maybe based on personal observation on what you really think what's going to happen. There are concerns of this, you know, dying down, hopefully not, but also perhaps considerations of, okay, why don't we do something more radical and things like that. So we'd like your thoughts on that. And also, I think uh, this is leaning toward greater cooperation between Bahasa Luneta and the Trillion Peso March. And Sol has highlighted a few ways, conversations can be had between these two parties and generally people among the left. And I think our question is, how do you imagine these conversations taking place? And how can it move forward? Because it seems like this is, key to unity among people who are currently protesting and hopefully creating change. So, Kiko, Sol, any of you would like to go first?
Yeah. Thanks all. Right. So I think as far as what will happen in the next few weeks, the next big milestone I think is December 15, which is the deadline that the ombudsman gave for the filing of heavier cases. And we're seeing um different bodies sort of give back and forth, go back and forth on who would be included here. So for instance, I think I forget which body said this, if it was the ICI or the DPWH, but I think there's some back and forth over over which senators would be charged come December 15. Initially, the name of former Senate President Escudero was included. Now, they're going back. They're sort of rolling that back again. We saw something similar happen with Speaker Martin Romualdez, where initially the president cleared his name a little bit after the Zaldico video came out. The Department of Public Works and Highways sort of said they were recommending charges to be filed against the speaker. Then, a little bit after that, the Independent Commission on Infrastructure rolled that back again. So I think there's a lot of ambiguity as who will actually be charged on December 15th. And if we see, I think, all of the big names be charged, and it's seen as credible that that broadly speaking, the Marcos administration is following the evidence where it goes, then maybe the calls for protest might not come across as strongly. But I think that's what people are waiting for. And one interpretation for why the crowd was smaller is maybe people are looking at December 15 as that sort of bellwether as to whether bigger protests will happen or not. Um, and then I think as far as prospects for greater cooperation between the Luneta and EDSA sides are concerned, I I can't say that I can't say how realistic that is in the coming days, just given the recent level of spice, vitriol. I don't know. Vitriol is too strong a word, but like the temperature basically between the two sides has been rather high. So I think while I think it's positive that it is starting to calm down a bit. I think and I was discussing this with some friends who were a bit more who are a bit more sympathetic to the Luneta side since I work with the EDSA side. Um, I feel like the root of this comes from two different sort of um attachment to two different manifestations of what people power is, right? Where the I think the EDSA side sees people power very much within the 87 constitution that came out, right? And so um it's important to note that a lot of these people were not just there in 1986 for the first EDSA revolution, but were also there for 2001 and the second People Power Revolution, which while I think that is seen as positive, we also saw the president being replaced by a vice president who I think the consensus views ended up being more problematic, right? And so I think both on one hand, the attachment to the constitutional order in the 87 constitution makes it difficult to support anything that is sort of in the face of that, and things like definitely things like military junta are kind of circumscribed very clearly, but even the notion of a transition council, I think it needs to be fleshed out, but at least speaking for myself, on the face of it, it seems hard to square that with the constitutional order. So that's on one end, and on the other hand, there's again the specter of who will replace the president if he does resign. And the constitutional successor is the sitting vice president, again, who again is concerning. And so that's why I think, while we didn't, or at least to my knowledge, we didn't prevent anyone from calling for resignations in EDSA. The organizers ourselves are hesitant to explicitly make that call. One, because to Marcos specifically, but even in the assessment of calling on both to resign, given the personalities of the two, it seems one is a lot more likely to resign than the other. And so I think even a resign both call, even though I think it's a moral one and it's an appropriate one and it's a constitutional one, the consequences of such a call, I think, are difficult. Whereas, again, I think on the side of the left, I think they view people power more in the lens of the assertion of the will of the people as embodied by the uprising. And so that kind of model, I think, is a bit more appealing to them. And I think the question of the constitutional succession of the vice president, maybe they find their answer to that in the idea of the popular uprising. So I think that's the source of difference as far as political direction is concerned. And then the other layer is, aside from the sort of the specific calls being made by the two sides, there's also like a whole background of animosity that um I don't have the confidence to speak about, but it comes out quite often as far as like these discussions are concerned. So I don't think this is the least likely point for cooperation. I actually thought that um the aftermath of September 21 might have been I think actually I thought it was less likely at that point because of people would be were spooked by the violent dispersal. So now maybe I feel like I think having seen the ugliness of the discourse the last couple of days, people might cooler. There's a chance that cooler heads would prevail, but I wouldn't bet on it being the most likely outcome, I guess. Yes, I think that's my take.
Thank you so much, Kiko. I'd like to call Sol now.
Okay. The one thing that's certain to happen in the coming weeks is Christmas. So, yes, I agree. There could be something with in the next couple of weeks over the investigations, but at the same time, you never know suddenly what else might also occur, right? But if I'm not mistaken, probably the next big protests will be next year, right? Early next year, maybe around February, because the next big sort of political anniversary will actually be People Power at EDSA, February 22 to 26. An event that under the Duterte presidency, the Philippine government stopped officially commemorating. And under the present Marcos Jr. government, I think it has been at least ignored, if not, at least not reviled, but ignored, if I'm not wrong, officially. So, what I'd like to so I obviously I can't answer the second question from an organizer's perspective. Just a few observations are what I'd like to make. Just want to point out that EDSA DOS, part of the problem in retrospect, in addition to having elevated Vice President Arroyo at the time to the presidency, who was just as venal and corrupt as maybe even more so as the person she replaced, and the long presidency of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, 9 years, the longest post-dictatorship presidency, due to this sort of succession, her succession to the office. I just like to remind ourselves that that was also done through extra-constitutional means. Because the impeachment process, the trial was derailed. In retrospect, perhaps what should have happened was after given the burgeoning protests, and Estrada's sort of ambiguous resignation might have been or maybe before his ambiguous resignation, would have been to somehow complete the trial process. I don't know. But anyway, that's hindsight, right? So I'm just saying that it looked like a constitutionally compliant process, but actually it was not. The other thing I'd like to comment on in terms of the protests is that it's just still so important, right? I really don't see the protests fractured as the progressive center left may be. It's still our best chance at getting justice, at addressing the system of plunder and so on. Why? Because the most likely scenarios are that, number one, Marcos somehow hangs on. All of this is just, blips. But the overall outcome is that Marcos hangs on until the next election in 2028. Another likely scenario, more likely than either pro-democratic reform, like real genuine reform, and more likely than the resignations of both Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte, is that Marcos is deposed by forces loyal to Sara Duterte, and that spells disaster, because then it's not just democratic backsliding. I think that means a democratic collapse into authoritarianism. So the most constitutional route actually is an impeachment of both. Because frankly, Sara Duterte already was impeached. And even if we never see a smoking gun, Marcos Jr. as president, whose family members are being implicated in grand corruption, and the officials, in his administration and in the alliances that made up Romualdez led Congress, he's responsible, right? In a normal democracy, right? Parliament would have been dissolved by now, right? And the prime minister would have fallen on his sword or her sword. So that means that the question is, but then because we've seen with Sara Duterte's impeachment, they just need to ignore the Constitution, right? And then you fall back to either options 1 or 2. Marcos hanging on or Marcos being deposed, and democracy utterly collapsing. So the most important question to us is, how does a people-centered outcome happen? And I think that is the guiding question for all groups who want to see democracy prevail, who want to see justice prevail, and who want to see those who have stolen possibly billions, if not over 1 trillion pesos from public coffers. We want to see justice for them, right? So perhaps that is the guiding question. How does this people-centered outcome happen? Because even if we're only counting 2 sides, and the reality, as I said earlier, is it's not really only 2 sides, right? Within each side, there's a multiplicity, a plurality of actors. Neither of the 2 major sides, let's say, have actually gained or thought through how a people-centered outcome can happen. They have the vision of it, which is so valuable too. We have at least 2 options to consider, right? One more reformist and one more radical. But neither side has actually thought through what the pathway leading to either outcome would be. And so I do hope that these conversations for cooperation will be eventually taking place sooner, hopefully, rather than later. Because this is it, guys. We're all that's left, right? And so, without solidarity, without some way, at least to start a process to go forward, we will be part of the problem. Okay, I think that's what I had to say about that.
Thank you. So we do have one spicy question from someone who DM'd me, and I think this connects well with what you said earlier. Do you think that the lack of unity between these different groups will be the downfall of the movement as a whole? I think this can be our second to final question, and then our penultimate question, and then we can uh, do the final question. But so, what do you think? And then we'd like to go to Kiko as well.
What was the question? Would the unity between who?
These 2 groups, the asker said, will the lack of unity be the downfall of the movement as a whole?
Oh, I see. No. Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and answer. No, because this lack of unity has persisted over decades, during the dictatorship and after. I mean, this is a consequence of people being principled and people also being intellectually honest and unable to simply because that's the thing with unit team, right? Unit team, as in like the Duterte and Marcos type of unity, which can simply unify when it's politically expedient and then fight to the death, when it's no longer when it no longer serves their own self and political interest. So no, I think I would still like to believe that splits in the progressive movements, unfortunate as they are, in terms of making the center left or the left a true political force to be reckoned with. The last time that had happened actually was the armed communist insurgency during the dictatorship. And for the CPP-NPA, it's been in decline since the strength in terms of its numbers and so on. One thing that we didn't mention actually is the fundamental reason why there's been a split in probably the most significant part of the left has been because of an internal bloody purge that occurred actually after the end of dictatorship. And the lack of peace and reconciliation around that split continues to bedevil the left, and for good reason. But okay, so anyway, for as long as dissenters live and breathe, there will be dissent. And I mean, there's probably no real scenario anyway that they will be the ruling power. But the progressive left, even with its disunity or fracture, without them, people will never be held to account. So the worst case scenario is an authoritarian scenario. The left will go underground again, probably, or be arrested en masse, etc., including people like ourselves, Kiko. Right? It will be a repeat of what we saw in the darkest days of martial rule. But it will never completely disappear, I believe.
I think on my end, I think I'm a little earlier in the order of battle than Sol is, but I think in terms of collapse of the movement, I largely agree that I think unity is not unity as in marching together under one banner, acting lockstep, I think is not, I think, a necessary thing for the movement to succeed. But I will say that I think again the temperature does need to go down. I think if the this isn't, I think, unique to progressive politics, but I think there's a saying that if your enemy is drowning, don't throw them a life raft or something, right? I mean, maybe that's not the best way to put it, but if you're, however slightly, if the attention of the public, or if not the public, the part of the public as a whole, the part of the public that actually listens to the opposition, if their attention is drawn towards this infighting rather than the issue at hand, then that weakens enthusiasm for the movement, right? So I think there's an effective division of labor, and that can maybe for the progressive side, for the center left. And I think that can maybe even accommodate differing views on differing views of the future. Although, again, if push comes to shove, even I would have to debate against things like the transition council, unless it can be explained in a way that's, I mean, I'm open to explanation, but currently, those things do have to be debated. But the broader point is, I think there is room for like a division of labor that can even accommodate these slightly differing views of the future. But I think what is counterproductive is the again the animos the public vitriol being shown, right? So and so I think that the need for communication is there. It's just having worked with one side more than the other, but I have worked with the other side as well. Um, having worked with both sides, I think that sitting down to the table cannot be rushed. If you say someone that, for example, if you tell someone, for instance, that you are going to be the end of us because you're not going to sit down on the table, that's not a good faith way to start a conversation, right? So I think that kind of confidence needs to be built by both sides again. And maybe we can get to a point where I don't think it's realistic to be on the same page exactly, given how different the pathways that are being imagined are. But at least agreeing to a certain cessation of hostilities and a broad understanding of a division of labor as far as confronting already the two different flanks of Marcos and Duterte are concerned. I think that might be a bit more achievable, and I think it would go far as the movement is concerned.
Yeah, if I could just make a two practical suggestions. Number one, maybe don't have these conversations on Facebook, right? Maybe within each camp, for anyone who's listening, uh, maybe we can ask those Facebook warriors to just maybe cool down a bit. Let's just let things breathe. Um, and secondly, yeah, maybe it would be good for both camps to identify people who have some experience in bridging the gap and maybe start the conversations with them.
Thank you, Sol and Kiko. Oh, I hope my voice was in. Okay. Thank you, Sol and Kiko. Apologies, as we do have one more question from a participant from the University of the Philippines. And I think we can end it on this question with an additional note on what can Southeast Asians do to be in solidarity with the Philippines. So it's a two-parter right there, but let's start with the first one. Earlier this year, the attempt to impeach Vice President Duterte was declared unconstitutional because of the Supreme Court decision that applied the 1 year bar. No new impeachment complaint can be filed until February 6th, 2026. This means Congress may attempt another impeachment process next year. For both speakers, I'd like to ask what might be the implications if an impeachment effort is revived next year, both for the ongoing protest movements and for the possible outcome of the process, given the current divide in both Congress and the Senate. Nico, perhaps
Sure.
the
I
mic
don't know
is
if the
on.
speaker is still here, but when they say a new impeachment process, are they referring to impeachment against Vice President Duterte again, or against President Marcos, or someone
I
else?
believe Duterte specifically.
Duterte. Okay.
Yeah, because Marcos can be impeached anytime now.
Right. Okay.
And Sara Duterte can only be impeached again, can only be impeached again in February. Yeah, it's a good question actually to ask ourselves as well. Why aren't articles of impeachment already being filed against him as they were? Um, Maybe it is the fear of a Sara Duterte succession that's holding people back. So this is a question of tactics as well. But
Right.
if Marcos deserves to be impeached, then he should be impeached.
Right.
Then we deal with Sara in February. But
Yes. Yeah, I think I'm on the same page with Sol there, and also recognizing that I think a big fear on the with respect to President Marcos, there is some fear as to what the post impeachment situation would look like, whether in terms of success or failure. Like, so success, Sarah steps in terms of failure. Okay, if the same rules that were used to block Sara Duterte's impeachment, are going to be used again to block President Marcos's impeachment, then how do we go on from there, right? um it might actually be okay, then we're boxed into calling for Marcos's resignation, and then again we end up with Sara becoming president. But all of that being said, I do think that it's still, I think, not good for democracy to give a sitting administration a free pass just because of how scared we are about the vice president. So I think also, practically speaking, again, considering the new rules presented as far as impeachment and the necessity of evidence at the initial stage is concerned, it might be that we don't have like the physical evidence for to start the impeachment complaint against President Marcos, because the strongest testimony against him is given by Zaldico, and he didn't do that under oath. So I think if there's a person who implicates the president under oath, I think it becomes a bit more, or it becomes untenable not to impeach him, or it becomes untenable to still have to wait till February to impeach him. But yes, it is a question of there's a big question of tactics in terms of whether we should do it. I think again, the moment that evidence arrives, it should happen. Now, as far as the impeachment of Sara Duterte is concerned, how would that affect this? Um, I think oh, as far as public opinion is concerned, my fear is that it'll be received even less positively than the first impeachment attempt. Because the one time that there was a very, very small plurality in favor of impeachment against Sara Duterte was in November of the heels of her not just the corruption, which had been building up in the Quadcom hearings in the months prior, but when she had her outburst saying that she hired an assassin to kill President Marcos, the First Lady and the Speaker of the House, if anything were to happen to her. I think the one time that there was a soft plurality in favor of impeachment was the polling soon after the first few complaints were filed and she had that outburst, right? I think now and then what happened since, I think, is the focus on Duterte ended up going back to corruption. And it became, and right a few weeks after those first complaints were filed, the 2025 budget was released. And a lot of the red flags on corruption sort of emerged there as well, right? So the corruption argument against Sara Duterte became a lot weaker given the corruption that was also emerging in the current administration. So I think in this context where corruption is the focus and then an impeachment is relaunched against Sara Duterte, if the focus is on corruption, my fear is that again it will be seen as sort of small fish compared to like the hundreds of billions because the corruption associated with Sara Duterte currently is in like the hundreds of millions, which it's kind of weird to be saying, that's nothing. But I mean, I worry that people might feel it that way. Now, that being said, I think it is necessary. And in terms of long-term anti-corruption, you need to see both brought down. And you might even see more vigorous anti-Marcos protest if from both sides of the progressive bloc, you might see more vigorous protest once Sara Duterte the Sara succession scenario is not is sort of ruled out. So I think it might have a long-term positive effect, but in the short term, getting the public behind an impeachment against Sara Duterte when their focus is on this corruption issue, I think is a real challenge. So again, there's
Well,
a very big question of tactics as far as both impeachments are concerned.
yeah, but I'd also like to point out, though, it's not just impeachment that's available for
Right.
redress. There is an NBI case that had been opened against Sara Duterte earlier this year on the
That's right.
basis of her threats of violence against the president and the first lady. And there are cases filed with the ombudsman, you know,
Right.
for the over corruption in the vice president's office and the secretary of education. These were also arguments that she made to the Supreme Court, right? Like against her own
Mhm.
against her own impeachment. So it's a good question to ask, right? Like, what's happening? Why are these cases
Yeah.
getting stalled?
Yeah.
And so, the problem with this transactionalism and
Right.
trying things in the court of public opinion is that, well, it's a problem, right? The institutions are weak, but the
Mhm.
institutions are there. And if
Right.
these institutions aren't used, then yeah, people get away scot-free. So I think Marcos should be impeached. I think Sara Duterte should be made to face until we can impeach her again in February, or we, meaning Congress, until she can be impeached again in February. There should be these other cases. But fundamentally, there's also the question of the justness of having discarded the impeachment against her. I think the
Right.
Supreme Court was wrong. And this is the problem in the system. The Supreme Court is by definition always correct, but actually it can also be wrong, right?
Right.
So there are so many possible ways of going about this to get justice and to hold those people who have uh, who have done criminal acts to hold them to account. The problem
Mhm.
is who's going to do it. When if you rely on elements of the traditional politicians who are currently in power and vying for power, we can't rely on them to do what's principled, right? But the avenues are
Right.
there. And then if it's civil society is also exhausted in infighting. So who's going to do it, right?
Yeah.
But these things are available.
I think I'll just say very briefly that like the the criminal cases definitely need to be pursued, the ombudsman, the NBI cases. But I think is it settled? Is the immunity from suit question settled? Like definitely the president is immune from suit. And then there's a
But not
question like
Sara
whether that
Duterte.
extends to the right.
Yeah, no,
That's been
not for the
settled.
NBI
Okay.
cases. I don't think so.
Okay. Right. But again, like that's enough. So definitely there's room for those to progress in the meantime. But I think it's clear that the only way she can be removed is through impeachment. Right. So it's
But she was already
still a
impeached.
necessary step to go
And
through.
yet,
It's through conviction following
yeah,
impeachment. Sorry.
yeah.
Right. So,
And the
it's
problem is even
mhm.
even the bar for evidence, right? You already had the smoking gun in Sara Duterte's case. So ultimately, impeachment, it was the trial was still derailed and all of that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
this is like a shitty game of chess, you know. You're just like constantly being blocked. And it's not even two opponents. It's like multidimensional chess, right? Like you see on Star Trek. But
It's
anyway,
Chinese checkers with it's Chinese checkers and you're missing like half your pieces.
yeah, yeah. But it's not impossible, right? It's not
Right.
impossible. It's just
Yeah.
improbable or highly constrained to get accountability for those who should be held to account.
And I guess to put a bow on it, no, like even for me, who's fairly like wedded to the 87 Constitution, I can understand how, in good faith, given what we've talked about, how people would look for something more radical. And while that's not what I'm advocating. Maybe that is the basis, not necessarily for unity, since I don't think I'd be willing to give up my position on it, but just the basis for okay, can we calm down? Can we talk? Can we agree on a division of labor and then go about our separate ways and not necessarily be counterproductive with each other.
Separate but in the same direction, maybe, right?
Right.
Plurality
Right.
might be the name of the game. And Tony Lavinia does put forward an interesting idea, which is when they talk about transitional council within the frame of the constitution, it would be something along the lines of a like a
Right.
constitutional convention or something like that.
Mhm.
So I think there is definitely room to discuss as long as there's a
Mhm.
willing for people to participate.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sol and Kiko. I'm very pleasantly surprised with the number of questions coming in, and
Oh, okay.
um,
There's more.
no, no, no.
Ah,
Like the two previous ones, but we did go over time. Apologies, but it's been a very interesting conversation, and what a way to head toward the end as well. I think before we end this discussion of two things, first of all, I'd like to share the feedback form for anyone who'd like to give us feedback and let us know what kind of events you'd like to see from the MFN next. But also, just to end the event, I'd like to invite Sol and Kiko to share with us what can Southeast Asians do amidst um, these happenings. And there have been statements of support. There have been social media calls from all over Southeast Asia. What can we, a sibling, that's what we've been saying for the past few months now. What can Indonesia, Malaysia, civil society everywhere, what can we do to be in solidarity with Filipinos?
I can go first. Um, I'd like to learn a lot more from experiences around the region. I'd like to learn more about the Milk Tea Alliance, for example, and how that may have stayed alive or not. Um, I'd like to learn from protests in Indonesia, but also perhaps in other parts of Asia, but at least Indonesia, right? And perhaps the earlier Bersih protests, so which were also anti-corruption in Malaysia, and how it toppled Najib, but similar to EDSA DOS, didn't quite have the genuine, the more democratic outcomes in the long run that we would have hoped to see in Malaysia. So, let's hopefully keep these conversations, have fora like these ongoing. Because the fact of the matter is there's not a lot of interest across the region about each other. It seems to be a very small and specialized, mostly academic, I suppose, group of people who are actually interested. But that's also not necessarily true, right? Like you see a lot of these cross, there will be an ASEAN People's Assembly, I suppose, in Manila, because the Philippines is hosting the ASEAN Summit. So maybe this is something we can do as a side event or as a conversation at the next ASEAN People's Assembly, for example. Let's talk about protest and let's talk about solidarity. And hopefully, by that time, there will also be more solidarity within the Philippines to come to the table. But let's see.
Yeah, I think on to Saul's point that there's not a lot of conversations. I feel like I'm the prodigal son asking, going back to their father and saying, "Could you help me out?" After not really paying attention to to the the family business for a while now. So it feels a little weird to ask ASEAN for help given how even for sort of civil society, how outside the radar Southeast Asia can be sometimes for civil society, for people in the Philippines. But I think just maybe one other aspect other than what Saul discussed was I think it's also worth listening to the voices of maybe Filipino communities that are in your own countries, right? Since we're sort of all over the place, and their view is an increasingly important one in terms of not just electorally, but in terms of shaping the opinions of their families here. And just to get another sense of like how are people looking at this corruption issue, because definitely like two political science academics don't have like that aren't the representative cross sections of the Philippines. So I think that might be a good accessible step for people that people can take.
And that brings us to the end of tonight's event. Apologies again, everyone, for the overtime, but I hope you all enjoyed tonight's event because I know I really did. And don't forget about the feedback form. And thank you again so much, Kiko. Thank you so much. So for tonight's presentations, they've been really enlightening, and we're now more keen to learn more about the Philippines in the coming weeks. Hopefully, more good news, not just bad ones. And hopefully, we'll see each other in future MFN events. And again, thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you so much to everyone for tonight. Hopefully, we'll see you soon at our next MFN event.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you,
Thank you,
Kiko.
everyone.
And see you
Thanks all.
on campus
Yeah,
or on the
maybe.
streets.
Yes, maybe the latter a bit more often now. See you.
Okay, see you. Bye.